Hey guys, Nintendrew here, and today we're talking about this guy, the Nintendo 64 gamepad. This may be one of the most controversial controllers of all time, and is the subject of countless jokes and memes about people with 3 hands and horrible joystick wounds from vigorous rounds of Mario Party. But is it really all that terrible? In my opinion, this is one of the most well-designed controllers that Nintendo's ever made, and in some small way may have even influenced the design of the Joy-Con. I know that sounds a bit ridiculous, but hear me out, I have my reasons. So without further ado, let's get to it. Now, first things first, let's get this out of the way. I don't think the N64 controller is perfect by any means. There were some real issues with this thing, which we'll cover in just a moment. But in this video, I think I'll be able to argue that the 64 controller didn't suffer from a poor design, but rather from poor execution. So first, let's cover this controller's most common problems. Undoubtedly, the biggest issue with this controller today is its joystick, and the problem lies deep within its mechanism. Now, while this is often considered to be the first analog thumbstick for home consoles, it's actually not really analog at all. Instead, it uses 2 optical sensors to approximate analog input with digital values, kind of like an old computer mouse with a rubber ball. More modern controllers use potentiometers to report true analog values, but at the time, the 64's optical sensors were probably cheaper to produce than potentiometers. Now, in theory, that's not really an issue, but the real problem with this joystick has to do with its materials. See, you've got this plastic stick sliding around within a plastic bowl and rubbing up against 2 plastic guards. With just a few years of moderate use, friction can cause these parts to break down, leaving your joystick completely loose and unresponsive. Thankfully, there are some clever people trying to solve this problem today, like SteelSticks. This is a company which is producing replacement joysticks that use a polymer contact point with a polished steel bowl, which will take a lot longer to break down. In the end, this isn't really a problem with the controller's overall design, but rather with how they chose to manufacture it. Another issue that people often take with the 64 gamepad is its shape is just weird. It's not conventional in any sense of the word. The main complaint here seems to be that there's no way to hold the controller comfortably while still having access to all the buttons. It looks as if it really was designed for someone with 3 hands. But of course, that is 100% intentional. Anyone who's familiar with the system knows you're not supposed to have to claw-hand it like some kind of monster. You were never supposed to be able to press all the buttons at once. To dive deeper into this issue, let's take a look at the overall layout of the controller. The 64 gamepad is meant to be held in one of 3 modes, if you will. The first configuration is to hold the middle and right handles, with access to the joystick and face buttons. This is probably the one you're most familiar with, and was intended for 3D games like Ocarina of Time and Banjo-Kazooie. The second configuration is the opposite, and this was used mainly for first-person shooter titles. This setup allows players to move forward, backward, and side to side while precisely aiming with the control stick under their right thumb. The third and final configuration is to hold the 2 outermost handles, and this was meant for a more traditional 2D playstyle. Now, this position was rarely used at all, but some titles like Mischief Makers relied on that D-pad for precision platforming. Before the launch of the N64, Nintendo was actually pretty cautious. 3D games were a very new territory for developers, and Nintendo certainly didn't expect third-party studios to jump on that bandwagon so quickly. So what they did is they basically hid a more traditional controller layout inside the 64 gamepad's design. Take away the 3 handles, and you're left with something that looks suspiciously similar to a Super Nintendo controller. Adding a couple extra face buttons served 2 more purposes. In 2D mode, this could emulate the layout of the 6-button Sega Genesis controller, which at the time had a reputation for being much better than the Super Nintendo for fighting games. And in 3D mode, the C buttons were designed to control a game's camera in 3D space, much like how modern games tend to utilize a second analog stick. In fact, the C in C buttons stands for, you guessed it, camera. This hybrid design allowed devs to rely on the systems of input they were already familiar with, but also gave them the opportunity to dip their toes into 3D experiences when they were ready. This is similar to how the Wii Remote sort of transforms into an NES controller when turned on its side, for virtual console titles and 2D platformers. And this kind of design was even built more elegantly with Nintendo's Joy-Con controllers, which allow you to literally take off half of the gamepad and pass it to a friend, complete with a full set of inputs for co-op multiplayer. Now you might be asking, why did they only add 1 analog stick? They've got these 4 buttons up here to control the camera. Wouldn't it just be easier for them to add a second thumbstick and forget the hybrid layout altogether? But you've got to remember, this was a time before analog sticks were mainstream. Players needed a bit of time to adjust and get used to this new style of control. Now, it would be unfair for me to not mention the PlayStation's dual analog controller, which came out about a year after the 64. That was another step forward in perfecting the designs we see today, and the influence of Sony's controller can still be seen in gamepads for every major platform, including the Nintendo Switch. But one thing the N64 doesn't seem to get too much credit for today is the introduction of vibration feedback to home consoles. On the backside is a port which allowed for a variety of accessories, the most consequential of which was the Rumble Pack. This added the option of force feedback for developers and became the standard for nearly every new game on the platform shortly after it was introduced. Much like Sony's dual analog sticks, this is another design decision which has changed game controllers ever since. But the biggest thing we haven't talked about yet is the issue of time. When the Nintendo 64 first launched, the feedback for this controller was overwhelmingly positive from both players and developers alike. This truly was a step forward for its generation, and wasn't really all that controversial until other, more influential controllers, like Sony's DualShock, influenced the market and further improved how we play. Today, there are better ways to play the N64, undoubtedly. The Brawler 64 is one of them. This is a third-party controller which launched just a couple years ago and attempted to bring the official gamepad into the 21st century with a more modern design and a much improved analog stick. In fact, this is my preferred option for playing the console today, but I still have a bit of a soft spot for the original. Again, I'm not saying that the N64 controller is perfect by any means, but next time you hear someone say it's the worst controller ever, maybe this video will make you think twice. Or you could always just look at the Virtual Boy. Hey guys, thanks so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this defense of the N64 controller. As always, if you did enjoy the video, please do consider subscribing to Nintendrew for all sorts of cool gaming content, and make sure to share it with any friends who might find it interesting. Otherwise, I'll see you in the next one. Take care.